Okay, so I just was trying to thank Julia Kamen for her help with this, and anything positive that comes out of it should be, she should receive credit for it. So the main question that I'm trying to ask and approach with this research is, what is the effect of the increasing centrality of Latinos to the Democratic Party on broader patterns of political partisanship in the US? Before I get into this question, there's a couple points about partisanship that are helpful to contextualize it. One is a kind of truism in political science is that partisanship, and particularly the party ID of the candidate that one supports, is relatively stable over time. A second point is that while rare, we know that mass shifts in partisanship can and have occurred, especially when the social identities associated with parties shift. So the classic example of this is after 1965, after the Voting Rights Act was passed, there was the reenfranchisement of a lot of African Americans in the South that changed the social imagery of the Democratic Party, and there was a big shift among whites away from the Democratic Party. A third point that's useful is that Latinos are changing the landscape of American partisan politics. So many of us know that the number of Latinos in the US and the number of Latinos that are in the US electorate has about doubled over the last 20 years, and that the large majority of these Latinos identify with the Democratic Party. So 3 out of 4 Latinos tend to identify and vote Democrat. This is really useful information, and perhaps information that people who spend their lunch hour going to talks on American politics might already know. But is this information that the general public is aware of? And I argue that it is, and I argue that it is for a couple of reasons. One, we know that the Democratic Party has been doing much more outreach towards Latinos than the Republican Party, and the frequency and amount of this attention and outreach has increased over recent years. People are exposed to this directly through direct exposure to these ads and appeals, and also indirectly through a lot of coverage of these appeals and ads. We also know that the partisanship of Latino elected officials leans heavily towards the Democratic Party. About 90% of Latino partisan elected officials are affiliated with the Democratic Party. We know there's significant differences in the use of anti-Latino rhetoric by partisan elite. So while both parties can be charged with using and champion things that are perceived as anti-Latino, we know that Republicans have been associated with language and with policies that have been less favorable to Latinos and immigrants, especially in this last election. And we also know that there's been growth and attention to issues disproportionately affecting Latinos among Democrats. So things like racial profiling, things like immigration and the DREAM Act tend to be issues that are more central to the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So there's a lot of reasons to think that the centrality of Latinos to the Democratic Party is something that's widely recognized and people are aware of. So it brings us back to the question, what is the effect of the increasing centrality of Latinos to the Democratic Party on broader patterns of partisanship in the US? And to answer this, I do a couple things. Let me start with my hypotheses. So there's 2 ways that this might affect outcomes. One might think that because the Democratic Party is the party that's historically been associated with civil rights, especially since the 60s, that the growth in the Democratic Party's attention to Latinos will increase favorability for the Democratic Party among white Democrats. A counter hypothesis would be that just the opposite would occur, that among white Democrats, seeing the Democratic Party spend more on outreach and attention to Latinos would change the way they think of the Democratic Party and decrease their support for the Democratic Party. Seeing the Democratic Party do more outreach to a group that one does not identify with perhaps will decrease support and identification with that party. And so if that was true, and if that operated as I hypothesized, we would expect that dynamic to be explained and mediated by a perception that whites are more associated with and are thought of more when you think of the Republican Party. So I look at this a couple of ways. I began by looking at this in 2012 when I did an experiment in which people were white Americans were randomly assigned to see one of 2 Obama ads. And these were both ads that Obama actually used. They were ads that were either entirely in English or that were narrated in Spanish and English. The visual content of the ads was the same. The only thing that was different was one was narrated partially in Spanish. A sample of about 600 non-Latino whites were randomly assigned to see one of these 2 ads, and then I subsequently asked them about their attitudes towards Obama. And so you can see that when we look at Republicans and we look at Democrats, you get a sense of the big difference in the degree to which whites favored Obama. When they saw the ad that had Spanish language content, there was not a big difference among Republicans, but we see a significant difference among Democrats. White Democrats were less likely to support Obama when they saw an ad with Spanish language content relative to when they saw an ad that was entirely in English. But this includes language, and we know that there are unique effects of language, that perhaps this wasn't due to Latino outreach, perhaps this was just due to the fact that many white Democrats didn't understand the content of the ad or didn't understand part of it, and so maybe that's what led them to feel excluded and see him less favorably. So I looked at this again this year, 2016, last month, and what I did was I had a similar online sample, and respondents were randomly assigned to look at one of two websites, and these were labeled as websites that we were asking respondents to evaluate the layout of these websites. And so the two websites are almost identical except for the title of the featured article. One features an article that says Hillary courts undecided voters, and one features an article that says Hillary courts Latino voters. So a very subtle difference in the two treatments. So again, it was an online sample. This time it was all white Democrats. About 350 non-Latino white Democrats were randomly assigned to see one of these two websites with an article about Hillary courting undecided or Latino voters. And I asked about their level of support for Hillary after evaluating these two websites. And so again, we can see that when white Democratic respondents saw the website about her courting undecided voters, they viewed her more favorably than when they saw the website about her courting Latino voters. And then I also asked about their vote choice. This was in October, so did it affect actually their likelihood of voting for Hillary? And again, we see it did. White Democrats were about 10 percentage points less likely to say they were going to vote for Hillary when they saw an ad about her courting undecided voters relative to when they saw an ad, a news story about her courting Latino voters. So this is all really useful information, but again, it leaves a lot that's unknown. What are the mechanisms behind this? And does it actually mean that they were more likely to vote for Trump, or does it just mean that they were more uncertain about their likelihood of supporting her? So I run a similar experiment, again, with the two websites featuring a story about her courting a Latino or undecided voters. And I ask about the likelihood of respondents supporting Hillary or supporting Trump. And then I ask about these other mechanisms that I mentioned, both how the groups that they associate with each of the two major parties, as well as some other things that might operate as mediators, such as status threat. Perhaps it was the fact that Democrats felt like their own status, white Democrats felt like their own status was threatened by increasing attention to racial others. Perhaps it was the strength of white identity. So I look at all of these things in addition to the main dependent variables. So again, the first thing I'm showing you is just when respondents, white Democratic respondents, saw the news story about Hillary courting undecided voters. This is the likelihood of respondents favoring Hillary and how much they favor Trump. When they saw the news story about Hillary courting Latino voters, you can see that they were less likely to favor Hillary and about 9 percentage points more likely to favor Trump. Did this actually translate into vote choice? I find pretty good support that it did. When people, white Democrats, saw the news story about her courting Hillary, again, they were about 12 percentage points less likely to support Hillary when they saw the story about her courting Latino voters, and about 8 percentage points, or 9 percentage points more likely to support Trump. But what was driving this? One possible theory I put forth was that it was driven by the social groups associated with each party. Did respondents actually think that Republicans represented them more? When white Democratic respondents saw the news story about Hillary courting Latino voters, they did think that Republicans were better represented, people like them. But there's no evidence that this served as the full mediation. It didn't complete the requirements of a full mediation. So it did increase the perception that Republicans represented whites and white Americans, but it didn't actually mediate the effects that we just observed. I look at some other things, and some other things that stand out. It did strengthen when white Democrats saw the news story about Hillary courting Latino voters. They did have a stronger sense of identification with whites. They did feel like their status was more threatened in American society. But none of these meet the requirements of a full mediation. None of these fully explain the effects that I just showed. Another possibility is education. This was a really salient narrative in the election. Perhaps those white Democrats who don't have a college degree feel particularly threatened by growing attention to Latinos and other groups because they feel perhaps that their own interests will be less represented. So I look at this and I actually find the exact opposite. It's white Democrats with a college degree that are most likely to reduce their support for Hillary after seeing a news story about her courting Latino voters. You can see they view her less favorably, and they're actually less likely to vote for her. Those without a college degree were slightly less likely overall to support her, but they were less affected by the news story about her courting Latino voters. Did it also affect in similar ways their level of support for Trump? And you can see that it did. There was no real effect on degrees of favoring Trump and no real effect on the likelihood of supporting Trump among white Democrats without a college degree, but there was a pretty significant effect among white Democrats with a college degree. They were significantly more likely to view Trump favorably and say that they were going to vote for him if they saw the ad about Hillary courting Latino voters. I keep saying ad, the news story about her courting Latino voters. If this is true, it should have held in 2012 when I looked at the Obama ad, and again, I find it was. It's white Democrats with a college degree that are really affected by this outreach and appeals to Latinos. They were about 14 percentage points less likely to view Obama favorably when they saw that the ad with Spanish language content. So going back to this beginning question, what is the effect of the increasing centrality of Latinos to the Democratic Party on broader patterns of political partisanship in the US? I argue that it is contributing to a new racial realignment of the American party system. It's depressing support for Democratic candidates among white Democrats. It's increasing the salience of white identity. It's increasing the degree to which white Democrats feel that the Republican Party represents people like them, although this is not mediating the main effect that I just showed you. And this effect is particularly pronounced among college-educated white Democrats. What do you take away from this? Well, there's a lot of things to take away. But I will say that demographic trends and voter participation rates illustrate that a large and growing share of the US electorate is Latino and are most effectively engaged by targeted appeals, by these types of appeals that we just saw that Obama used with Spanish language content that explicitly identify and speak to Latinos. And trying to appeal to everyone is obviously not going to win the support of anyone. Subtle appeals to Latinos have been shown to be unlikely to engage and mobilize Latinos, and they're unlikely to decrease whites from shifting away, as we just saw. So it leaves the Democratic Party in an interesting position where they either move towards Republicans and kind of don't explicitly appeal to Latinos, or they make Latinos and other racial minorities a central part of their campaign.